Hello, my name is Maria Ramirez, and I will be presenting the case of the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs versus the Inclusive Communities Project 576 US 2015. Some background on the case. The key actors are the plaintiff, which will be the Inclusive Communities Project or ICP, and the defendant, the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs, TDHCA. The year in court was the district court, and this occurred in 2015. The case does start in the district court, travels to the Court of Appeals, and then ultimately reaches the U.S. court. The location of this case is Texas, and what's being questioned at the moment is whether tax credits given to the TDHCA were being disproportionately distributed to low-income housing developers. Low-income housing tax credits are federal tax credits distributed to low-income housing developers through an application process. The distribution is administered by state housing authority or state agencies. In this case, the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs was responsible for the distribution of tax credits. The Inclusive Communities Project is a nonprofit organization dedicated to racial and economic integration of communities in the Dallas area. ICP sued, claiming the department had disproportionately granted tax credits to developments within minority neighborhoods and denied the credits for developments within Caucasian neighborhoods. Arguments. So the plaintiff's argument was that the department had allocated too many credits to housing in predominantly African American inner city areas and too few in predominantly white suburban areas. ICP argued that this practice led to a concentration of low-income housing in minority neighborhoods, violating the Fair Housing Act. The act prohibits discrimination in housing based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, familial status, and disability. ICP attempted to show discrimination by disparate impact, which meant that although there was no discriminatory intent, the practice harmed a protected group. The defendant, which was the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs, claimed that there was no less discriminatory alternatives and therefore not their fault. Question: does the disparate impact claim apply to this case? Key precedents cited: Huntington Branch NAACP versus Town of Huntington Second Circle 1988. It found that zoning practices that perpetuated segregation could violate the Fair Housing Act under the disparate impact theory. Griggs versus Duke Power Company 1971. This employment discrimination case under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act established the disparate impact doctrine. That stated that neutral policies can violate the law if they disproportionately harm protected groups. The court used this as an analogy of the Fair Housing Act. Using both cases, the court argued for the balance of civil rights protection with the use of safeguards against excessive litigation. A later case that would come into light would be the National Association of Mutual Insurance Company versus the HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. This took place in 2023 in the D.C. District Court. The plaintiff in this case filed a suit against the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development concerning the interpretation of the Fair Housing Act's disparate impact rule. The rule dealt with the legal concept that seemingly neutral practices can be considered unlawful if found to negatively affect a protected group. NAMIC argued that the rule was an overreach of AUD's authority and inconsistent with Supreme Court precedents. These found this rule to be invalid as applied to homeowners insurance underwriting and rent making, forcing them to consider factors like race and ethnicity that are not legitimate risk-related factors. The court ruled in favor of HUD, upholding its authority and finding the rule to not exceed the inclusive communities standards set by the Supreme Court. NAMIC appealed to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. This case is currently pending. District Court voted in favor of the ICP, found the department was unable to show the allocations of tax credits was based on compelling governmental interest and no less discriminatory alternatives existed. It held that the disparate claims are within the jurisdiction of the court under the Fair Housing Act. In the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, it too voted in favor of the ICP. The department appealed and claimed that the court had used the wrong standard to evaluate disparate impact claims. The court affirmed and held that the district court standard mirrored the standard put into effect by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the agency tasked with implementing the Fair Housing Act. Although the court agreed with the district court's decision, they reversed and remanded the decision on the primary issue of determining the correct legal standard to be applied in disparate impact claims under the Fair Housing Act. In the U.S. Supreme Court, a 5-4 in favor of ICP vote, did the district court use the correct standard for evaluating a Fair Housing Act claim of discrimination based on disparate impact? The Texas Department appealed to the Supreme Court, which granted certiorari or an order for a higher court to review the case. The court upheld the decision of the court below, holding the disparate impact claims are cognizable under the Fair Housing Act. Conclusion. The Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs versus Inclusive Communities Project confirmed that housing practices with discriminatory effects, not just intent, can violate the Fair Housing Act. The significance with this case is that it affirmed the disparate impact doctrine, it strengthened civil rights protections in housing, and it set limits to prevent frivolous claims.